Well, hello there and welcome to training. Tim Warner here, helping you to make sense of GitHub Copilot chat extensions. I do have one prerequisite for today's lesson. You need to know what GitHub Copilot is. Hopefully you've been using it to some extent. This is an AI-driven pair programmer that uses under the hood OpenAI's GPT large language model, or LLM. Forewarning, there'll be plenty of TLAs, or three-letter acronyms, forthcoming. You know how it is in tech. GitHub Copilot extensions are super important because they enable us to chat with other LLMs, including ones that we may have fine-tuned ourselves. However, there's some naming and branding confusion. I want to sort all that out for you quick smart. I have some resources aggregated on a public gist, timw.info/gcext. GitHub Copilot extensions, formally defined, are GitHub-based integrations that enhance GitHub Copilot's capabilities. These can be considered more of a universal way to extend GitHub Copilot. If you're a developer or a DevOps specialist or an ops person or a data engineer, you're in your IDE, your integrated development environment, you're in github.com, you're in GitHub Mobile, meant to be universal, with the underlying use case of access to multiple LLMs, specialized LLMs beyond the default off-the-shelf GitHub Copilot LLM. Let me do a bit of whiteboarding here. This is a screenshot extract from Visual Studio Code, and we can see in the GitHub Copilot chat interface, we can use the @ syntax. Again, the paradigm is just like you're in Teams or in Slack or in GitHub and you're @ referencing another person. We're able to do this now with GitHub Copilot. Specifically, step one, we invoke, in this case, the Copilot extension. @GitHub is a GitHub-hosted GitHub native extension that allows you to chat with it about your repos that you allow indexing for, and so forth. And then the API that you build with there allows users to use this # attachment syntax where we can get into our enterprise's knowledge bases and beyond. That's the basic paradigm here. Now, going further, I also want to whiteboard the architecture. Go to the resources gist, timw.info/gcext, because I give you the doc links. But a GitHub Copilot extension, the reason I keep saying GitHub is actually important because where you're hosting makes all the difference and is the root of the confusion. When you do a GitHub Copilot extension, let's say that we're Docker, okay? And we want to have our fine-tuned GPT. Don't worry about whether that GPT is an Azure OpenAI service or GitHub models. It doesn't matter. But we want our customers, our devs, whomever, to be able to chat with it, all right? If we're going to do a GitHub Copilot extension globally, we're hosting the project in GitHub. You can do any level of visibility, but notice that the ultimate top-level deliverable is a GitHub app. So in order to do GitHub Copilot extensions, you've got the rules of the road for developing GitHub apps and thinking about marketplace. Now, your GitHub app will house your extension, which is what ultimately your developers will load into their VS Code, their JetBrains IDEs, and then using the @ syntax, they'll invoke agents, which are nested API conversations with additional first and third-party LLMs that may be in GitHub models, maybe in Azure, maybe in AWS, maybe in Meta. It doesn't matter. And then when you're referencing them, you can invoke skills. The so-called / commands, those pound notations, those again are interfaces and methods exposed in the API. Here we go. Let me iron out the confusion. Drum roll, please. Copilot-enabled VS Code extensions. We're fundamentally shifting our dev, specifically to center, rather than in GitHub, the VS Code APIs. Why? Because if you're a fan of Visual Studio Code like I am, you know it's an incredible, amazing programmable API. So advanced VS Code access for tailored features. The limitation is that it's exclusive. The APIs are exclusive to VS Code. They interact with GitHub Copilot all day long, though, you see? So note that. And also the extension publication and consumption workflow uses Visual Studio Marketplace as opposed to GitHub. And here again, I'm using the @ invocation in my IDE, and I've got one up here. This is an Azure extension. It's in private preview, I believe, as of now, so I'm not going to link to it. But this one I know for a fact is a VS Code extension, and I installed it using the V6 packaging format. What is that expression? Are you picking up what I'm throwing down? It's a question of how devoted are you to universality? How devoted are you to VS Code? And if you can do both. I'm both in GitHub Cloud all day and VS Code. Hello, code spaces. So let me draw. These are my art, I'm proud to say, and give a link if you share. I want you to share this lesson if you find it helpful far and wide. Here I visualize how I see the world according to Tim Warner, these Copilot-enabled VS Code extensions. Here you're doing a V6 and publishing to the marketplace. You're accessing the VS Code Chat API. Big difference. It interrelates with GitHub, but it's a Microsoft property and not GitHub. And another layer of the confusion is you might say, well, Tim, GitHub is owned by Microsoft. You need to remember that GitHub, or if you don't know this, let me tell you, GitHub operates essentially independently from Microsoft. That's public. I don't disclose NDA stuff. So by accessing the VS Code Chat API, I wish the naming was a little bit more consistent. It's called a chat participant, not an agent. But again, this is your nested API conversation into first or third-party LLMs. Again, Azure OpenAI is just one option, GitHub Models is another one, and so forth. And then there's specifically a language model API that Microsoft maintains that gives you your / commands and all of the other things we've mentioned. I want to keep these lessons brief, so let's wrap up. Number 1, takeaway. For multi-IDE support via GitHub Cloud, I suggest you use or lean into GitHub Copilot API for extensions. If you have a use case where the bulk of your devs and people are in VS Code, you can go the extra mile and take advantage of that API. Now, you and I, hopefully, if you're thinking along the same lines, it's not an either or binary. It's a spectrum in which you may lean more one way or the other, but both may be appropriate. It's all documented for you, although full disclosure, we know this is early days with generative AI, so fully documented doesn't mean what it used to some years ago. timw.info/gcext. Well, thank you. I hope that you benefited from this lesson. Again, please share it far and wide. I want to get a lot of eyeballs on it. I welcome your feedback. I always stand ready to be corrected. The name's Tim Warner. Website is techtrainertim.com. Thanks again. Take good care.